Please listen carefully.
Welcome to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from City Works Expo. My name is Brad Stevens, and it's my absolute pleasure to bring you our guest today, Miss Alia Scanlon, the Global Project Director for Jane's Walk. Now, what's kind of your background, Alia, and can you walk us through how you wound up doing what you're doing and how you define what it is that you do now?
So I wear a lot of different hats at Jane's Walk. In fact, I wear all of the hats because I'm the only staff member. We're a one person right now. So the work that I do is a combination of, being an administrator of a program, but also doing community organizing.
Well, I'm intrigued. Can you fill us in a little bit on kind of the history of Jane's Walk and what that kind of path has been to being starting from a very grassroots place, as I understand, and now what it means for you guys to have a staff member?
Yeah, we've never really moved out of being grassroots. So even as we moved from one festival in one city about 11 years ago to 227 festivals and cities this last year. And even as we're operating now on a global scale, we always also are hyper-local and focused. So the way that we've grown has been sort of organically, as communities around the world have picked up the idea of hosting walking conversations about cities and running with it and doing them in a way that suits their communities and their needs of their cities. So Jane's Walk was started originally by friends of Jane Jacobs here in Toronto in 2006. They wanted a way to commemorate her legacy that didn't involve sort of creating the image of Jane Jacobs as like an idol. Like you can build a statue, and that's great, but I wanted something that would be dynamic and really take Jane's ideas and sew them into communities. So that first year, they came up with it about 10 weeks before the first weekend in May, which was she was born on May 4th. So they decided they wanted to commemorate her birthday. Came up with the idea, pulled together 7 walks in Toronto, and then had a really great time, and were really kind of surprised by the uptake by people in the community. And it just started spreading from there. We went from one city to 2 to 70 to 187 and to 227 over a decade, and we continue to grow.
I really like this idea that you articulated there. This idea of celebrating the work that someone has done without idolizing them. I think as you're probably familiar, down here in Virginia, we've been having some issues with literal idols and what to do with them now that we see the complexity of things. And so this idea of focusing on the work and finding a creative way to celebrate that really is a fascinating perspective on this.
Yeah, and I think it's especially important for when you're working in urbanism to recognize that cities aren't static; they change. Because as Jane said, cities are the people within them, and as populations change, the cities are being shaped by the people there as well. So a lot of what Jane said, a lot of Jane's ideas are no longer applicable in the same way they were back in the 70s and the 60s and the 70s. So, and I think she had enough foresight to recognize that cities are growing things, they're ecosystems. And she wasn't interested in her ideas becoming canonical in any way. She wanted her ideas to be dynamic and questioned and changed as we grow as a society.
How do you? I think that raises some really interesting questions about how do we get people to embrace the complexity and embrace the fact that the answers that we have today are probably not going to be the answers we have in 10 years. Do you have thoughts on how to kind of encourage people to embrace that complexity and think in that way?
I think complexity works. I mean, complexity is it's all, everything's always been very complex. Systems are complex, cities are complex systems. And the best way to go about solving problems that are complex is to consult as broadly and as courageously as possible with as many different types of voices and insights you can. So part of what the value of Jane's Walk is on a Jane's Walk, you're bringing voices into a dialogue that who would otherwise not necessarily be engaged. When you're a policymaker and you're hosting a public meeting or a public consultation on development, you have a certain type of person who's likely to show up for that, but you're missing a lot of key insights from stakeholders who won't go to a public meeting for any number of reasons. And when you're approaching complex questions, you are going to get complex answers. You're going to get divergent thoughts. You're going to get people who disagree with each other fundamentally about really important issues. But the answer always has to be to bring people into dialogue with each other.
Do you feel like it sounds to me like you're almost saying that we're probably never going to get to the same place, but I think there's also a feeling in some ways that there needs to be some kind of shared vision in order to move forward. Is there a way to create that shared vision while also allowing people to maintain their individuality and complexity?
And it's one that Jane Jacobs also encountered a lot. I do believe that platforms for grassroots deliberation on the big questions that we're facing as cities, platforms like Jane's Walk, or even informal places where we can have these conversations as neighbors and as community members. Part of what comes out of that is work towards a shared vision. And having the shared vision is important, but I do also think that it's important, again, not to believe that just because you've created a shared vision for now, that vision isn't going to change as the members of the community who are shaping that vision move in and out of it, or change their minds, or, have encounter different situations in their lives. So, the vision is important, but it should never be static. It's always on the move.
Very interesting. Well, I'm intrigued. I know from my perspective, what the Jane's Walks that I've been involved in, what's been the case. But can you walk our audience through kind of what a Jane's Walk would look like?
Sure. So a Jane's Walk is a walking conversation. It sort of borrows from the walking tour format, in that you all gather at one place and you have a route and a topic, but it's not about one person who's an expert telling you about those places that you're visiting or about the issues that you're talking about. That person is just there as an anchor for community dialogue. So Jane's Walks can be about really anything and everything. In Toronto, we've got 220 Jane's Walks every year, and they run the gamut in terms of content. So we have Jane's Walks that are about sustainability in the city. We have Jane's Walks about transit. We have Jane's Walks that are about creative spaces in the city, public art. Lots of walks about history, and lots of walks these days about housing. Housing affordability, gentrification. How can we make sure that the people who are living in cities right now aren't being pushed out of their communities. Walks that work to reconcile the legacy of, especially in Canada, this is a big one, the legacy of colonialization, working towards reconciliation with the Indigenous community. And when you're going on a James Walk, the only thing you need to do really is be willing to wander around for a couple of hours with people you don't know necessarily and have a conversation in an informal, friendly, safe way about a topic that might be of interest to you.
I'm intrigued. One of the major downsides of the traditional public engagement model is that you wind up with the same people complaining about the same things over and over and over again. How do you guys encourage new people to come into that conversation? How do you encourage those people on that walk to come from different places and different perspectives?
Well, part of it is the model itself that helps facilitate new voices coming into conversation. So because Jane's Walks are free and volunteer-led, they're more accessible to people who would not otherwise be engaged in a policy question or in a city building question. And anybody can lead a Jane's Walk. The job of the Jane's Walk Project Office is to sort of run behind community members who are organizing and leading Jane's Walks around the world and make sure they have what they need to be successful, so that anybody who wants to do this thing can do it with very little heavy lifting. All it takes is a little bit of like an idea and a route and a little bit of courage.
I think part of what is so impressive to me about what you guys do is the way that you are able to get those volunteers and use them. I think, all of us that are interested in seeing cities and places thrive recognize that there's a lack of resources, and we always wish that there were more to do what we want to do. And you guys have been able to really amplify your voice by engaging people with stories that they really want to tell and conversations that they really want to have. And I wonder kind of how, if you have stories of how communities that have really done well mobilizing their volunteers have done it, or kind of what has made those successful in places where they've really worked.
That's a really good question, and it's something that we're investigating pretty constantly. We see the uptake of Jane's Walks in some communities more in a stronger way than in others, and we're not entirely certain what the magic sauce is for that. We have lots and lots of cities in Slovenia, for instance, maybe like 26 cities in Slovenia that have Jane's Walks. And I think that comes from having a very, very strong organizer in those cities. So there's an organization that runs Jane's Walks there as a program of theirs. So essentially, you were talking about us sort of utilizing a volunteer network, and that's very true. Often, however, these volunteers are actually, taking Jane's Walk and tucking it in under an organization or an initiative of their own and running it that way. But there are also tons of individuals who are just these ordinary interested citizens who want Jane's Walk to happen in their city, in their community, and they want to know how to make it happen. For those cities, for it to work really well, it is a matter of bringing together a team of people, because nobody can do something like this on their own. So bringing together a group of other ordinary interested citizens who want to make this happen. And that's where it starts. And usually what we have found is that to one walk the first year, 2 to 5 the next year, and it starts growing from there as uptake becomes more spreads kind of organically in unexpected ways.
Well, I'm kind of intrigued now by this need for leadership, but also the desire to remain grassroots, and how communities find that balance. And so you need someone that's willing to take the reins and drive a project forward. You need a group of people that are willing to do that, but you really also want it to be as much community led as possible. How do you kind of find that balance between those two positions?
So as the project office with a great deal of restraint, it's actually a lot more difficult to sort of run behind somebody and lead from behind than it is to lead from ahead, than to say, this is what you're going to do and this is how you're going to do it. We have always taken the stance that the lightest possible touch is the one that will get things done the right way. By leaving all the decisions about what a Jane's Walk is about and where it goes and who leads it and who's there, all of that is up to the community. And Jane's Walk is, as long as your walk is free, open to the public, non-commercial and non-partisan, you can say or do whatever it is that you feel like you would best serve your community. So in striking that balance, it requires actively taking steps back from decision-making and from taking the lead. It means making sure that people who organize Jane's Walks in each city talk to each other and not just to the project office, building an intentional network across the world of brilliant urban innovators and thinkers and activists, and then hoping that they will take that idea of stepping back and then generating dialogue between people, that's something that they'll replicate locally, that the city organizers will take that ethos to their own cities and recreate leading from behind and leaving decision-making up to the community.
It's a very powerful vision in some ways, because I think what I'm hearing in some ways is a pretty radical amount of trust, which is something that is in short supply in many places. And it's an incredible lack of pride and humility as well to understand that this needs to be different in your place than it is here. And it's a very compelling vision, I have to say.
I love it, in part because, I don't know what would work best in Tokyo. I've got no idea. But I do believe that people who live places, the people who occupy those spaces, who live, work, and play there, are the best equipped to make decisions about what goes on there. So it means that there's less work for me. As a really lean organization with one person, that's the key to how we've continued to operate for so many years, is making sure that the ethos is strong enough and it's clear enough that everybody feels like they have whatever they need to be successful in their own local context.
We'd like to take a moment now to say thank you to our sponsors today. The Urban Affairs and Planning program at Virginia Tech School of Public and International Affairs offers an interdisciplinary approach to understanding planning and policy for megaregions, cities, suburbs, and rural regions in the U.S. and abroad. UAP faculty have expertise in urban planning, architecture, urban design, economics, geography, political science, law, technology, and engineering, and provide students with a multifaceted understanding of how communities grow and change. Students apply their knowledge and professional skills by participating in real-world problem-solving with community clients through project-based studios and applied research. UAP emphasizes technical analysis and policy evaluation in approaching the complexities of modern communities. So a big thanks today to the Urban Affairs and Planning program down at Virginia Tech for being our sponsor. If you'd like to hear more, check them out online. But without further ado, we'll get back to today's guest. Thank you. Well, I'm intrigued. We've talked a lot about the dialogue side of things, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the walking or being present in the built environment, or kind of however you conceptualize it. Why is that part so important to this as well?
A big part of that is that when you're having an in situ dialogue, there's an element of spontaneity that exists there. One example, a really good example, was one of my first James walks that I went on in 2015. We were walking through a neighborhood called Kensington Market in Toronto. And it was a planning student who knew about the neighborhood, but he didn't feel like he was an expert. So he was leaning really heavily on people who are on the walk to sort of fill in the blanks of his knowledge. And we were so fortunate that we had stopped in an alleyway where a large grocery store had just been built, and then on the other side of the alleyway was old apartments. And it was a large group of people, maybe 70 people. But this older resident popped his head out on his balcony and wanted to know what we were up to, and was able to tell a really interesting story about how his experience of his neighborhood is changing now that there is a big old grocery store right next to him, and how Kensington Market is being transformed by all of these pressures to stop being what it always has been. And that's not something that you can program. That's something that you get when you're fortunate enough to be out there wandering around a neighborhood, bumping into people, seeing things that you didn't know were there, things that you've walked past 1,000 times but had never noticed. It's something that we hear all the time on James Walks from people who say, I've lived in this neighborhood for 50 years and I had never noticed that, or I didn't know that story. And those sorts of things, that granularity only comes out when you're actually wandering around.
It sounds like it really enhances the spontaneity in some ways, that you're coming up, but you're not really sure what your collective knowledge is about this new area. You, like, as a leader, you might know that you want to touch on something in the next little bit, but it may be something else entirely that pops up, which is, again, a very interesting and trusting way to go through these things.
Yeah, again, it's a replication of the idea that you should take a step back. You know, you're not the expert on something, and that's totally fine. No, you shouldn't know everything. And in admitting that you don't know everything and that you're not the expert, you open the door for all kinds of incredible stories and knowledge to come out from the people around you.
Do you find that there's it's often communities that have a strong sense of identity that dig into this, or is it communities that are seeking, or what kind of communities do you think often benefit the most? I know we've talked about this a little bit, but I'm interested in a different kind of angle on it, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's the question of communities that have and don't have identity is an interesting one. We talk a lot about, we think about suburbs and how they don't have much of an identity, but they don't really feel like neighborhoods. And I think that I would push back on that a little bit, that, we have lots of James Blacks in the suburbs, not as many as in downtown areas with really strongly characterized neighborhoods. But we still have them out there. And I think that that's because people are seeking community. They're seeking community ties. And they're pretty fierce about it. They're very intentional about making sure that they know their neighbors. It's harder to do just because the way that many suburban neighborhoods are built. The built form discourages making those connections and having in situ dialogues about public space. But the people who live in suburbs are really, really going out of their way to find community. So I think Jane's Block works at both levels, so it can serve to forge ties and help create community identity where none exists or where it's starting to come together. And it can also, in a community that has a really strong character, people know what that community is about. It can help nuance the stories that we tell ourselves about that neighborhood, or it can challenge a narrative or bring new people into that dialogue.
That's really fascinating. I was working with a housing organization here in town that we were looking at doing some work and trying to figure out what neighborhood we might want to focus on initially. And we drove all around the city, and there's one neighborhood that I think could have been ideal and needs a ton of energy and thought, but that neighborhood doesn't have sidewalks. And it was almost like sidewalks need to be the first thing here before any other kind of work can come in, because otherwise it really is the kind of place that no one's going to meet their neighbors, because why would you walk anywhere when you have to walk in a dangerous thoroughfare to go anywhere? And it was an interesting conversation that we had never had before, that, and it kind of brings together this idea that all of these things are interrelated in some ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, kids are not going to go trick-or-treating if there aren't any sidewalks.
Well, as someone who doesn't like giving out candy on Halloween, that'd be okay with me. It's the other stuff that I want to skip on. But I'm I'm intrigued. Kind of, where do you see, as a organization that's focused kind of on this promoting dialogue, how do you guys envision that turning into action, or what's kind of the theory that says that this is? I imagine you guys kind of think of yourself as a first step that moves the conversation, and that conversation leads to action. But kind of how do you guys conceptualize that move?
Yeah, I think that a lot of times we talk about Jane's Block as being a festival or being a program or being an organization, but really Jane's Block is more of a tool. And it's a tool that, if you think of it as a hammer that can take any nail you throw at it. So as a method for getting lots of diverse minds around a problem, or bringing a community together spontaneously to notice that there's something wrong. Jane's Block is really effective. We've never really been able to track it effectively, and part of that is just because the walks themselves are ephemeral. They happen and then they go, and then they're over. But we do have anecdotal evidence of people meeting each other on the Jane's Block, talking about something and deciding to do something about it. People deciding that this is a problem or an issue that they want to get involved in. A lot of times, Jane's Blocks will spark a news story that gets even more people interested in a question or solving a problem. I'm trying to think of an example from this year's festival. I have these in a bank in my brain, but I can't access right now because it's Friday afternoon.
Absolutely. And when they come up, we can make time for it. But I do, we have talked a little bit about the traditional public forums, and these are things that governments have often run, and we know that they can be somewhat effective, but often not too effective. I wonder, kind of, what do you think the role of the government should be in fostering dialogue or supporting dialogue or getting things like this going? Is that something that's better left in the private sector to volunteer organizations like you guys, or what are you guys going to think about that?
I think it has to be both. I think dialogue has to be happening everywhere all the time. And it should, in some respects, yes, the dialogue should be convened and led by policymakers and public administrators. But more, I think what's often missing is opportunities for people who are decision makers who often get to talk into a microphone to just sort of shut up and listen to what people are saying. There just aren't very many opportunities to do that in a way that isn't adversarial. I think there's a lot of policymakers will have, they'll have their town halls, they'll have their social media, live, interact with constituents there, but that's always adversarial, almost always. Like, you have people who are angry or upset, and you can't actually have a generative conversation where you're coming up with ideas to solve problems in that kind of context. But on a walk, on a nice day in spring, you can set yourself up to really dig deep into what a community wants and what it needs, what it values, things that they wouldn't otherwise articulate in other settings.
It's interesting because it sounds like in some ways that act of being on a walk together is a very humanizing thing in some ways that then breaks down this power dynamic barrier that you have in these kind of settings where people are talking to a politician or in a debate or things like that. Is that something that resonates, that this is an equal footing type thing?
Yeah, we have lots of city councilors lead Jane's walks in most cities. So Toronto, almost all of the city councilors have led a Jane's walk. We always encourage them to not talk. Do some of the talking, but maybe limit yourself to about 30% of it. And do the best you can to just sort of stand back and let other people talk to you, and really listen to what they're saying.
That idea of listening is obviously so powerful that it's where we get understanding. It's how we build relationships. It's at the foundation of essentially everything. But it seems to, in some ways, to be something we're not particularly good at these days. How do we is that a skill you think we can build in some ways?
Yeah, I think it's being able to listen and empathize isn't necessarily something that we're born with. It's a skill that we learn. And I think a lot of that just comes from, I guess it just comes down to being a better person. Going into any situation with an open mind and an open heart, and being more courageous about talking to people who are not like you, who believe different things, or who come from different places, or who have different lived experiences. And that's so important in cities now, where it's always been important for cities, but it still holds true that cities are hubs where we're shoulder to shoulder and elbow to elbow with people who we just don't really know, and we don't really get an opportunity to talk to them or empathize with them. Learning how to listen and communicate empathetically is such an important part of how we exist together in cities.
Well, as you kind of work with all of these different places, I have this question that I think is too big of a question most of the time, but I kind of intrigued to hear how you take it. But I wonder when you visit a place and your reaction is that this place is doing well or this place is thriving, what are the things that kind of tip you off that a place is doing a good job?
That's a good question. It's a really big one. I think that's always so subjective. I think that we have some like objective measures of what makes for a good space. You can walk in it. It's visually pleasing to the eye. You feel safe and you feel comfortable. There are those things, but I think ultimately that that assessment, the assessment of a space or the assessment of a city, comes down to a very personal preference for how you prefer to experience public spaces. Mm. So for me, I spent 6 years in China. 5 of them were in Shanghai. And what I learned about myself is that I don't want to live in a city where there aren't any trees. Because there just aren't very many trees in Shanghai. And moving to Toronto, where we have this beautiful ravine system. And it's called actually a city in a park because we have so many green spaces. Has made me really happy. But that assessment is not going to be true for everybody. I think everybody who goes to a new city and is walking around exploring it should really do some, it's a good opportunity to drill deep into what you value in public space and what you think a good city looks like, because you're going to have a very different opinion than anybody else.
Do you think that every time you go to that new city, it helps you better understand your own place in some ways?
I think so, yeah. So, whenever you go to a new city, I do this, I'm sure. I mean, maybe you don't, but I am constantly doing a comparison. So I'm going, oh, they do this differently here. Oh, this is new. This is very different. So, people come to Toronto and they notice that our garbage cans on the street have little pedals that you can step on to open the lids, which people find fascinating. And they're really into that. It's not something that I noticed or that I think I would tell you, but you bring urban planners to Toronto and show them this, and they go, wow. And we do that because we have a raccoon problem. But it's details like that have you comparing one city to the next, to the other one that you've been to, and that's how you start forming an idea of what you think works.
And that's such a fascinating example because it's such a small thing, and yet it can have massive ramifications and can lead to these incredible conversations about priorities and what is, all of a sudden we're talking about solid waste, which is something we don't usually talk about, and that's just such a cool example. I mean, between trash cans that have steps for lids and being a city in a park, I mean, you're doing a pretty hard sell on your city up there, Leah, I have to say.
I do love it. I really love this city.
But as we kind of get towards the end here, I wonder, in your work of trying to create better places and create these spaces for dialogue, what are some of the biggest things you've learned along the way?
So I think, the number one lesson I've learned is that I just don't know everything. I don't know everything, which is something that I always knew, but I think a lot of the time when we're, in positions of leadership, we're expected to know things. But at Jane's Walk, I've learned to become very comfortable saying, I have no idea. But here's somebody who might know because they have lived experience of that. So often, somebody will ask me a question, and my function is to point them in the direction of somebody who really knows the answer and who would have an interesting perspective on it. It's been an exercise in, like I said, leading from behind, making sure that when you're leading an organization, you're doing so in the service of the people who are part of it. And making sure that they're succeeding. And your success arises from theirs.
It's again, that's such a compelling vision, just in terms of I think when we talk about nonprofits, I know that you guys probably have a slightly different system up there north of the border, but when we talk about nonprofits here in the States, these are supposed to be organizations that are led by their boards, and that is not often the case. They're more often vehicles for an executive director with a board along for the ride. And what you're articulating is a very different vision that I think is can be very powerful in the right hands. And when you see an organization that does it well, as you guys do, it's a sight to behold.
Well, thank you. It's like I said, it is actually more difficult to do it this way. But it works for us.
Well, if someone listening wants to start a Jane's Walk in their community, what do they need to do?
Visit our website, which is janeswalk.org. You can find information on how to bring Jane's Walk to your city there. If Jane's Walk already exists in your city, you can find information about your city organizer and get in touch with them. Or you can find my email address and just send me an email, and I'm happy to sort of talk you through the process.
Well, wonderful. I hope that we will see a few more pop up because of this. But if you all are interested in CityWorks Expo, you can check us out at cityworksexpo.com. But in the meantime, I do think I need to make it clear to you, Alia, that there's no such thing as a raccoon problem. They're the most glorious animals in the world.
Oh, you're such an optimist. You've never met a Toronto raccoon. Clearly.
Fair enough.
I've seen them walk up to children in broad daylight and mug them. They're scary.
Well, I'll take your word for it. But thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast today. If you like what you hear, please subscribe and leave a rating. It really helps other people find out about our fascinating guests and find the information that we have to share. Lastly, please save the date for our upcoming event, October 5th through 7th in Roanoke, Virginia. And keep up to date by following us on Facebook and checking out our website, cityworksexpo.com. That's cityworksexpo.com. Thank you guys again, and look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.